Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the second half of our course in diversity and inclusion and teaching others about diversity and inclusion. In this unit, we're going to talk about using different kinds of training methods and the pros and cons of each one. And as always, we're going to contextualize it with teaching about diversity and inclusion. Before you watch this lecture, if you have time, please read the article in Module 11 about when students resist a message. If you don't have time to read it before the lecture, please read it after, but it is a companion piece to this lecture. Now, consider as we are talking about how to design training to get students to enroll in the courses that Dr. Stacy Perryman Clark has told us about, we are not limited by the COVID pandemic restrictions. And by that I mean, if you want to design a way of teaching students about those courses and how to enroll in them that involves being in a classroom or involves having them do a hands-on activity with you in the room leading them, you can design your project that way. We are not just limited to social distancing and things of that nature, because we're trying to design something that will be useful for Dr. Perryman Clark going forward. Excuse me for looking to the side here. I am consulting some notes. When you read the article about why students resist certain kinds of messages, particularly diversity and inclusion messages, think about what you might do to overcome that resistance on the part of students. Diversity and inclusion can be a touchy subject for some students who maybe do not accept the idea that there are problems or issues with those topics on the university campus. So you're going to be theoretically working with people who have a variety of opinions on those topics. And the article talks about three kinds of resistance that students might have to diversity and inclusion messages. So we're going to think about those types of resistance as we talk about ways of designing a project or a program to encourage them to enroll in the African Studies and African American Studies majors. A couple of these resistance types that you'll read about are, the first is worldview resistance. And think about how if someone's worldview doesn't include a feeling of urgency about diversity and inclusion, maybe they, in their worldview, they think that there aren't issues with diversity on our campus or in our society. And that's their worldview. And they might be coming from a particular political or religious standpoint and holding that opinion. That can be really hard to break through because those worldviews are attached to a person's group that they identify with. So they're attached to our family attitudes and the attitudes of our friends and attitudes that we've held our entire lives. So it can be really hard to break through that worldview resistance. Another type of resistance that the authors of the article talk about that's really important to consider is what's called target group resistance. And that is when the people who you are aiming your message to feel that they are part of a group that is being singled out or being attacked. And some examples of this would be when we talk about white privilege, sometimes white students can feel defensive about that because they feel they're part of the target group that's being talked about. And in a similar way, if we talk about other kinds of social or ethnic groups, if we talk about African American students or international students or LGBTQ plus students or any group that identifies with that kind of a label or a community, then if those people feel they're being attacked by your message, resistance can occur. So, for example, if we are talking to white students about registering for African Studies and African American Studies classes, there might be some target group resistance there where that particular white student might feel that you are accusing them of being racist or accusing them of not being open-minded or accusing them of being part of a system that they don't feel that they're part of. So that's another difficult kind of resistance to bust through. And the third kind of resistance that the article talks about is narrative resistance, where everybody's got a story, everybody's had an incident where they have experienced something firsthand in a particular way that may not be the norm. So you might be trying to pitch something to people that goes against their own personal narrative. So I introduced those forms of resistance here and contextualize them in terms of our project so that as we go through these different training methods that you might choose to teach people why and how to register in these courses, you can have that in mind, that you might have to be overcoming certain blocks that people might have toward registering in courses that would normally be outside of their area of interest. So let's proceed with looking at these training methods and how we can combine them. As we always do in these video lectures, I'm going to start with objectives. And my objectives for you at the end of this lesson is that you'll be able to name the strengths and weaknesses of the lecture, the experiential activity, and facilitate a group discussion for training people and teaching people about why they should register in these courses and how to go about registering in these courses. So we're going to look at those different ways of getting that message across. And then the second objective is that you'll be able to list and define the parts of the edit technique, which is a technique we use for processing an activity with our trainees. This quote is very useful for us to think about. Most professional trainers do not simply walk into the training classroom and make learning occur. It's not that easy. What trainees don't see is the many hours of preparation that it takes a trainer to remain effective in the training classroom. And this is very true of training and teaching. The people in the classroom don't always see the hours of preparation that go behind what you are presenting. My students don't always see the hours of time I spend looking for relevant articles, relevant video clips, creating these PowerPoints and video lectures, grading papers. That kind of stuff all happens behind the scenes, so students don't always see that. And in the same way, your trainees won't necessarily know, but you will know that a lot of preparation goes into effective training, and we're trying to arrive at an effective training program here. So what we've been doing all semester and what we will continue to do is building the blocks of our project. Something called scaffolding, where we go step by step by step, and each step builds upon the last. So you'll remember we started by interviewing Dr. Stacy Pearman Clark about her needs. You did that needs assessment. We designed a survey which we're going to be administering, and there will be a couple more steps in this process so that by the time you get to devising your training plan and actually theoretically, if you were going to be working with people with this program, you would have laid the important groundwork to have an effective training session. So let's start by defining our terms. What are training methods? What are we talking about here? Well, training methods are the procedures you use to present information and demonstrate behaviors you want trainees to learn. So it's the technique that you choose to get your message across, be that a lecture or a demonstration or a performance or a hands-on activity. whatever method or combination of method that you choose to convey your message and to teach something is your training method. And they're each used for different things, and they each have different pros and cons. So you want to choose strategically among them. We want to avoid just leaping to the idea that lecture is best or hands-on activity is best. But we want to have reasons for choosing the ones we do, and also an awareness that we can choose more than one, and we can combine them in different ways. For example, almost every kind of training has some element of a lecture, even if it's just a short segment at the beginning to explain the topic and explain what people are doing. So we will learn how to combine these different training methods for best result. So what I want you to do is to be aware of the differences and to know how to strategically choose the correct method to convey the content that you're trying to teach. So let's start with the first and most common method of teaching or training, which is lecturing. And we'll look at some of the pros and cons of lecturing. And as we do so, think about the courses that you've taken and what listening to lectures is like for you as a student. So first, the pros of lecturing. Professors like lecturing for a number of reasons. There are a number of reasons why it's a convenient way of teaching. First, you can cover a lot of material in a short time. If you only have 45 minutes or you only have an hour, lecturing allows you to structure your lesson in such a way that it will fit within the time that you have, and it gives you the control over the session. Putting people in discussion groups or doing an activity kind of takes away your control, whereas lecturing gives you control. You're the person talking, others are listening, so you can structure the time. You can look at your watch and see how much time you have left and whether you need to hurry up, or perhaps you could explain things at greater length. Also, lecturing is flexible for different size groups. So if you're going to be using the same lesson over and over again, and you are going to be giving that lesson to a group of 20 this morning and a group of 200 this afternoon, you will be able to use the same lesson with both size groups with minor modifications or maybe no modifications at all. So these are some of the reasons why teachers like the lecturing method. But as with all things, there are cons. There are negative aspects to lecturing, and most of the negativity is what happens to the trainees or the students. It's not negative for the trainer, it's negative for the audience mostly in these ways. Okay, so the first one, it can be trainer-centered rather than trainee-centered. So if I'm standing at the top of the room delivering a prepared lecture, my focus mentally and physically is on myself. I'm telling it the way I want to tell it. I'm telling my own stories. I'm not inviting feedback or questions from my students. So it's more focused on me than it is on you. Also, there is a performative aspect to lecturing, and this is probably happen in classrooms where you've listened to a lecture. It's easy for the audience or the students to become passive because it's like you're watching a performance, especially in the classrooms that are like big lecture halls with theater type seating where the professor's on a stage. That particular room structure just lends itself to an audience being passive because it's like watching a performance. So that can fail to be engaging. You're not giving your trainees or students anything to do really other than to listen and to perhaps take notes. And depending on the delivery style of the teacher or their personal dynamism, lectures can be kind of boring. Listening to someone talk for a long period of time, our attention can wander. We have a limited attention span, and in today's media-focused world, it's getting shorter and shorter. So we're not accustomed to sitting in a chair for an hour listening to somebody talk to us or talk at us. So it's very hard to remain focused. So these are some reasons why lecturing may not be the ideal form of teaching, especially not long lectures. As I mentioned before, a certain amount of lecturing is usually necessary even before an activity just to give your students some context and tell them what they're going to be doing. But lengthy lectures or doing all lecture can really lead students to be disengaged. And that's why I try to employ something in the classroom called the 15-minute rule of teaching. And the 15-minute rule suggests that we should change things up every 15 minutes because that's kind of the outer limits of a person's attention span. So you can lecture for 15 minutes, then do an activity, then show a video clip, then have a discussion, then go back to lecturing. But you need to switch it up every 15 to 20 minutes just to keep people engaged and to not wear out their attention span. So that's something to consider when you're designing a training project, that you might need some lecture, but you don't want to go with all lecture if you're concerned about keeping people engaged. In order to keep lectures engaging, a combination of lecture and discussion is really useful, and I try to do this in my classroom. First, you can use immediacy behaviors. Immediacy behaviors are ways that the teacher can make contact with individuals in the room. So you make eye contact with people. You might walk around the room. You might mention people's names who are in the room. Just trying to make that one-on-one human contact with the people in your audience. Those are called immediacy behaviors. We also try doing this online. It's a lot more challenging, but having online discussions, talking to you individually. When I do my lectures and let you see my face, this is an immediacy behavior. When I do my weekly pep talks that I send out, that's an immediacy behavior. It's trying to connect with all of you, to show you my humanity and engage with your humanity. So that's an important thing to think about in a large lecture setting. You can also use various engagement strategies, which are listed here. First of all, stimulus prompt to get trainees thinking. So give them a word or an idea to focus on during the lecture. Give them a partial phrase where they need to fill in the blank, for example. You could say, the most challenging thing about diversity is blank, and that's a stimulus prompt. Ask them to think about that, or think about how are diversity and inclusion the same and how are they different, and let students use that as a thought prompt for the entire lecture. That's a stimulus prompt. Rhetorical questions to permit reflection. You might pose a question to the group that is not, you're not soliciting an answer, you just want them to think about something. So you could say something like, what does the average WMU student care about most when they're registering for classes? You could pose that as a rhetorical question where you're not really asking them for an answer, you're just planning an idea for them to think about. And then discussions, leading a discussion, which I'll give you some suggestions for in a few minutes, or journaling. You can use the stimulus prompt as a journal prompt. Maybe some of your professors have done this in class where they'll have you just free write a short reflection based on a prompt that they give you. All of these methods are ways of engaging the student in a lecture type of lesson to create a little more immediacy and to sustain interest. The next method we're going to look at is experiential activities, which are just what they sound like. They're doing an activity, they're having an experience in order to learn something. And as with lecturing, there are some pros and cons to experiential activities. So let's take a look. There are a lot of positive things about engaging your trainees, your students, your audience in an activity and giving them an experience, a hands-on thing to do in order to learn what you're trying to teach them. It engages them. First of all, you don't have that problem that you might have with lecturing of people kind of mentally checking out on you. It's interesting if you give me some parts and tell me we're going to build something, I'm curious and I have something to touch and do. It can increase trainees' self-confidence because they are not only being told how to do something, but they end up seeing that they can do it too. And it helps the trainees transfer the training content to real life. So if you were to, for example, have students practice a hypothetical course registration hands-on, then they're able to transfer that to their own lives. When it's time for them to register for their own courses, they will know what to do. So it has that practical application as well. So all of those things are positives about doing some kind of activity with your trainees. But of course, there's a downside. There is potential for things to go wrong or things to not be accepted well. So let's look at some of those. First of all, trainees can feel threatened. If it's something that they're not skilled at doing, or that they're not interested in doing, or that they are resistant to doing, it can feel threatening. Just a example out of thin air, I can't swim. I took swimming lessons as a kid. I was afraid of the water. I still do not like to be in the water. I will wade at the beach. I will go in somebody's pool at, in summertime when it's hot, if I'm just kind of like up to my armpits in water and I'm just relaxing. But I'm kind of afraid of pools and water. I don't want to dive in and that kind of thing. So if you told me that we're going to do an activity that involves you jumping into a lake, to overcome fear or something like that, I'm going to feel very threatened because the activity itself is something that I'm resistant to. So how can we contextualize that with diversity and inclusion? Well, as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture, there are different kinds of resistance, and one of those is target group resistance. So you might have students who are resistant to the idea of registering for these kinds of courses because of personal beliefs or past experiences of their own. So they might feel threatened by an activity that's going to teach them how to register for these kind of courses, or that's going to encourage them to consider taking these kind of courses, because the concept itself is threatening to them in some way. Trainees may not understand the relevance of the activity. This is something that in teaching we call the so what question. And I'll ask you this. Have you ever had a class where the professor leads you in an activity and at the end of the activity you say, okay, well, that was fun or that was interesting or whatever, but what was the point? You have to make sure people understand the takeaway, and sometimes you have to make that explicit to them. You have to answer the so what question. And unfortunately, a lot of teachers fail to do this. They fail to process the activity and talk about why did we do this and what did we learn. So that's another possible drawback of experiential activities. And then this last one, you may lack clear direction or run out of time. And I imagine that you've probably experienced both of those too, where either the instructions were not clear to you, so you spent a lot of time saying, to your neighbor, wait a minute, what are we doing? What are we supposed to do? And people are raising their hands and saying, could you explain that again? Or you run out of time so that the participants don't get a chance to finish the activity. So if you haven't planned carefully and structured things to fit inside the time frame that you have, those kind of problems can happen. So speaking of experiential activities, what are some kinds that we could do? Well, one is role plays. You've probably participated in these before, where, for example, if you were trying to teach customer service representatives how to give good customer service, you might put them in pairs and have one person play the role of the angry customer and the other play the role of the customer service rep who's going to try to solve their problem, and let them enact those roles as a way of learning. You can do case studies where you give them a scenario from a real life business or social situation and have them analyze that. You can play games, which, games as experiential activities, they're a lot of fun, but they're a lot of work to design and plan and to structure it to fit within the time you have. You might have to create game pieces and things like that. So those can be challenging, a lot of work up front, but a lot of fun and engaging for your audience. And then finally, hands-on practice to actually have people do the thing that you're asking them to go out in the future and do in their own lives, but here we're going to do it in the classroom. We're going to have hands-on practice with the real thing. So for example, if I'm teaching you how to bake a cake, we're in the classroom, I might actually have you put the cake mix in the bowl, crack in the eggs, mix the batter, things like that, so that when you get home, you can do that on your own. When you are designing an activity for participants, there are several stages that you should go through in preparing that activity. First one is to plan. You need to have objectives. What is it that you want your participants to be able to do at the end of the activity? What would be a positive result? Okay, that's the first thing, is to have specific objectives going in. You want to prepare your activity and develop very specific instructions. And this can be challenging because our minds tend to jump ahead. When we know how to do something well, it can be very hard to break it down into step-by-step directions for somebody else. So one of the things that I do when I create instructions for something is I have someone who doesn't know how to do that thing review the instructions. I just have like a beta reader. I give it to somebody else to say, does this make sense to you? You who have never done this thing before, do these steps make sense to you? Have I omitted anything in the process? So that can be useful. After you develop your instructions, of course, you present your activity to your participants and lead them through it. And you can unpack that activity using the edit process, which I'll introduce in just a second. And then at the end, you need to assess. You need to go back to those objectives that you had in the beginning and say, did I meet my objective? Does the participant know how to do this thing? Can they demonstrate it, or can they explain it now? So if your objective is met, then you have created a successful experiential activity. So after you've done the planning and preparing and you get to the third step, which is to present the activity. So at this point, you have all your trainees together in a room, for example, and you're going to actually do the activity. These are some things that you need to do. First of all, make sure the instructions are written out step by step. Secondly, provide all trainees with a copy. Now, you've probably done group activities in classes where the instructor puts you in tables of 4 and only gives one copy of the instructions to each table of 4. If that has ever happened to you, you know how frustrating that can be, because not everybody can see them or read them all at the same time. It's best, even if you're having people work in groups, to give everybody a copy of the instructions. Make sure they understand the instructions. So give them time to read the instructions and to ask questions. Before you actually launch them out of the gate to do the activity, make sure everybody understands the instructions, they get it, their questions have been answered, and everybody's ready to go. Provide time guidelines. Tell them how much time the whole activity should take, how much time each activity should take, and monitor your trainees during the activity, including for time. So what I'll do is I'll walk around the room, I'll visit each trainee or visit each group, see what they're doing. Sometimes I'll sit down with the group and take part in their discussion for a couple of minutes. But I will also try to keep them on track time-wise. So if there are several steps to the activity that you're having them do, you might periodically say, okay, at this point, we're 10 minutes in. You should have completed step 1 and be starting on step 2 right now. If you're not in step 2 at this point, you're a little bit behind. If you are far into step 2, you might be working a little too quickly, and you should be starting step 3 then at 20 minutes after or something like that. So keep giving them time updates so you can keep them on track. If they're not staying on track time-wise, that alerts you that they might need help. You might need to go over and sit down with that trainee or that group and move them along. So a moment ago, I talked about the so what question, or making sure your trainees understand what they did and why they did it. And I mentioned how in some classes, your professor might have you do an activity that afterwards you say, oh, well, that was fun, that was interesting, but what was that about? Why did we do that? So the edit system helps to answer the so what question. And it's a nice procedure for unpacking what happened and making sure that your students or trainees got out of the activity what you wanted them to get out of it. Okay, so EDIT, EDIT, stands for experience, describe, infer, and transfer. First part, experience. Experience the activity. They do the activity. That's step 1. Step 2, describe the experience, what happened. This can be a fun step. Go around and say, okay, how was that for you? Describe how that went for you. Describe what happened as you were working on the project. And you'll get a variety of responses to that. Well, for me, it was easy. For me, it was difficult. I was distracted. I didn't have time to finish, that kind of thing. Third step, I, infer. What did they learn? So what did you learn from doing this activity? And then fourth step, transfer. How will you use this in your real life? Okay, so how can you apply what you learned here today to your job or to your experience as a student? So you experience the activity, have them describe how it went for them, talk about what they learned, and then how are they going to apply that experience. This is a crucial step at the end of any activity. You want to process the activity with your students, so you have to build in time for this. If you have an hour for an activity, you need to build in, say, 15 minutes at the end to go through this edit process, to put a button on the end of it where you know that they leave that room understanding what they did, why they did it, and how it's useful. And the third training method we'll talk about is group discussion and the pros and cons of discussion. And I'm sure you've been through many group discussions in your courses and in your workplace perhaps, and you are probably thinking of a lot of benefits and challenges right now. Let's take a look. So a few of the pros of group discussion: it can involve everybody. So it's not as passive as lecture. Obviously, everybody can theoretically take part. The participants can learn from each other rather than just being limited to the knowledge that the teacher has. They can also hear things from one another. And there's a perception that it's safe. How safe is it? We'll get into in a moment. But there's a perception often on the part of the person leading the discussion that, oh, I'm an accepting person and I'm creating a safe environment for people to talk. So there's no reason why people would not want to come forth with their ideas. And some cons to group discussion, and if you're a person who doesn't love group discussion, I'm sure you can think of more than this. But these cons are mostly for the facilitator, for the teacher, for you as a leader of a group discussion. Some of the things that you might have a challenge with. First, keeping the discussion focused, keeping it on topic. The discussion, since you're giving up your control and letting everybody take part, the discussion can go off on these side tangents. And sometimes those side tangents are interesting to pursue. And sometimes you're enjoying the enthusiasm, and sometimes you don't want to throw cold water over someone's participation, but yet you've still got to keep steering people back on topic. So that can be a challenge for the facilitator that takes a lot of mental effort to do. Secondly, you might have unequal participation for any number of reasons. Some students just don't feel comfortable speaking out in class. Some students might feel threatened by the topic that is under discussion. You might have some people trying to dominate the discussion, which has the result of intimidating others from speaking. So trying to equalize that participation, again, is something that's kind of hard work for the facilitator, trying to make sure that the same person isn't talking all the time, that other people get a chance, that kind of thing. Thirdly, inability to manage emotions. Now, if you're talking about a topic that might be somewhat controversial or somewhat personal to people, they could get emotional about it. And something like diversity and inclusion might be one of those topics, and we talked about these different forms of resistance. You might have white students who are resistant to the idea of white privilege, for example. You might have minority students who are uncomfortable with the feeling that you're talking about them, So there might be some kinds of personal resistance going on there, and those sometimes can lead to emotional expressions that you as a facilitator were not prepared for. For example, someone might cry, someone might walk out of the room, someone might get angry, and you might have a couple of students arguing. So again, as a facilitator, it's your job to try to keep things as neutral as possible and as safe an environment as possible. We all like to think our classrooms are safe environments, but the responsibility for creating that safe environment falls on the facilitator. So you want to make sure everybody feels like they have a chance to be heard and that emotions can be calmed. Here are some ideas for how to facilitate a productive, positive group discussion, and I try to practice these in my own classroom. First of all, be patient, don't answer your own question. Now, it's hard when you're the facilitator, you're the person at the front of the room, and you throw out a question and nobody reacts. The silence can be uncomfortable. I've learned over time, it's okay to just let the question hang out there for a while, because people need a second to absorb what you've asked. They need a second to think about their own answer. They need a second to think about whether they want to share their response. Give them time. That's part of making the discussion a safe place, is to allow people to think a little bit. So learn to be comfortable with silence and don't answer your own question. Just let it hang out there for a while and someone will be ready to talk. Mingle with your trainees, walk around the room, make eye contact. Making the training room a safe place, again, can be a challenge, but one way to do that is to be respectful of everyone's participation, even if somebody says something that's irrelevant or asks a question that isn't pertinent. Still react respectfully to that person to increase comfort. Repeat or summarize what people say as a way of moving the discussion forward. And again, provide a wrap up. And that edit process is a really good way to do that. I included this picture to demonstrate a way I have of leading discussions in the classroom. And those of you who've had me in the classroom might have participated in something like this before, but it's a really effective way of managing discussions in my experience. What I do is, first I have the students prepare a worksheet outside of class and bring their written worksheet to class. And on that worksheet, I ask them 4 to 5 questions about the course content. It might be questions about the reading they were supposed to have done for that week, or questions about a video clip that they're watching. But this way, everybody comes to the classroom having done their work, because I collect those and they're worth points. So then when students get to the classroom, I put them in groups of 4 and have them share what they wrote down. So just in their small group, they talk about what their answers to each of the questions was. So again, it's less threatening because you're only with a few people. I let them sit with whoever they want. So by this point in the semester, they're usually sitting with people that they know or recognize as classmates that they've interacted with before. So they've had the chance to prepare their answers on their own. They've had the chance to share those answers with a small group. Then for the third step, I mark the whiteboards. You see here it says D and E on this one. The questions were A, B, C, D, E. I have the students come up to the board. I invite them to come up to the board and write down just words or ideas or blurbs or thoughts that are relevant to that question. So for example, the things that people wrote for question D, you see on the left-hand side of the board here, just different ideas and words that people wrote down. Then I bring the whole room together for a whole class discussion, and we go board by board. I'll say, okay, for question A, oh, this is interesting what somebody said, and I'll read the sentence aloud and say, who wants to react to that? Or would the group that contributed that like to elaborate on that? That kind of thing. And it really gets people going because it's less threatening than being called on or being asked to speak individually. So you see on the left-hand side of the board here under question D, someone wrote, what about pleasure? So when we get to that question, I might say, okay, for question D, someone contributed the idea, what about pleasure? Well, what do you think about that? How is pleasure related to what we're talking about here? Or would the group that contributed that like to elaborate on what your thinking was when you wrote that? And again, it's just a really good way of getting everybody to come together. These discussions have lasted not only till the end of the class time, but I've had to say, guys, class is over. We need to get out of the room so the next group can get in here. So it's been a really effective way of engaging people in my experience, and I offer it to you as something to try either now or in future for facilitating discussions. So as you're designing a project that will encourage WMU students to enroll in African Studies and African American Studies program courses, think about the training methods that we've talked about here and which of those might be most effective as part of your little package that you're going to offer in the end to Dr. Stacy Perriman Clark for her use in trying to recruit students for the program. What is the best way to go about informing students and encouraging them to enroll and making sure they know how to enroll? What kind of little training or teaching package would you devise to accomplish those ends, keeping in mind all the pros and cons that we talked about today? So our next steps are, please make sure you read the When Students Resist article in Module 11 and that you've learned about the three kinds of resistance mentioned there: worldview resistance, target group resistance, and narrative resistance. And then think about how WMU students might be resistant to our messages about diversity and inclusion and our messages about the benefits of enrolling in African Studies and African American Studies courses and how you might overcome that resistance. And that resistance might not only take the form of a reaction to the subject matter, but it might also be a concern whether these courses fit into their curriculum or whether they'll be able to graduate on time and things like that. So think about all the forms of resistance that you might face with students and how you might devise a message to overcome those kinds of resistance. And then we're going to be conducting our surveys the week ending the 27th. It is the week that begins the 21st and runs through the 27th. And the instructions for conducting those surveys will be up on e-learning in Module 11 shortly. If they're not there yet, they will be there by the 21st so that you can proceed with that piece of the project. As I've said before, I really appreciate everybody's gracious messages and gracious acceptance of my need for a little extra time over the past couple of weeks, and I'm really encouraged and excited to move forward through the rest of this term. So email me if you have any questions. Take care. I'm thinking of you, and I wish you a great week. Bye.